So I had the great opportunity from 1968 till 1984 to be working as a contractor at the Johnson Space Center for NASA and supporting NASA on both the Apollo space program and then later on the Space Shuttle program. I worked for a company called TRW Systems, and on that particular program, we were direct support, as in hands and arms, for the folks that, from NASA that were supporting the missions. And my particular specialty was re-entry. And then on Shuttle, I'll talk about that in a minute. I worked for IBM, and IBM was building all the onboard software for the Space Shuttle. So what I wanted to do with this book, what I'm doing with this book, is it's a memoir, which sort of, I guess, makes it science fiction in a way. But I wanted to talk about that layer of folks that don't get a whole lot of attention. And because I've worked around them, this book is called Safely to Earth, The Men and Women Who Brought the Astronauts Home. And I tried to make it's coming out, it's available now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and others. It's a hardbound. Yes, it's a hardbound. This is why I copied it there instead of my last comments. But what I've done with this book, what I'm trying to do with this book, there have been books written flying about astronauts, like First Man, or like Last Man on the Moon, which is Ken Cern's book. There have been books written about the folks at aircraft, I worked at mission control, so that failure's not an option. With Gene Kranz's book, we talked about all the work that was done on the ground to support those missions. And then Apollo 13, of course, which is the movie, which we talked about a lot. But there were 400,000 people who worked on the program. And what you don't hear very much about is those others, the other, whatever, 399,000 or more people who worked at that level and what it was like. And so since I had a chance to work on a piece of that, which was for Apollo re-entry, I wanted to talk about what that was like, but also about the people I dealt with and that I learned from one of those programs. So what I'm going to do today is just read you 2 or 3 short excerpts. I'm not really going to read the whole thing. Why would you buy it? But I want to take a couple of excerpts, 2 or 3 excerpts, short ones, and just give you a feel for this. So this first one this is a subchapter called You Need a Different Plan. As I was to discover many times in my career, smugness often summons its own repayment. This particular one came due when I was supporting NASA during a briefing to crew members of an upcoming flight. Not just any flight, but the big one, Mission G, also known as Apollo 11. From my engineering notes that I kept in those days, the meeting occurred in April of 1969, several months before the launch itself, and about a month before the next scheduled flight, Apollo 10 lifted off. This could have been a refresher briefing for the Apollo 11 crew, bringing them up to date on the last-minute adjustments we've done to their procedures for their own flight, now only 3 months away. I do remember that only one of the astronauts from the crew attended the briefing, the command module pilot. Since he was the one that had to fly it, the CM pilot was charged with acquiring an in-depth understanding of how the onboard computer would handle re-entry and what to do if it went astray. So my schooling that day came at the hands of either Michael Clemons, the command module pilot of the prime crew, the astronaut who later went on to the moon on that flight, or Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot of the backup crew. I think it was Mattingly because he had been a late addition to the Apollo 11 backup crew and was likely focused on catching up. The memory of my come down that day is sharper now than the agent who provided it. Using my experience piloting the command module simulator through numerous re-entries, I developed a specific procedure for the crew to use to ensure that the onboard computer was operating properly during the spacecraft's initial plunge into the atmosphere. I recommended that the command module pilot monitor the disk displays on board for a specific set of data values, and when the spacecraft reached its maximum G-force, 6.5 Gs, at about 2.5 minutes into re-entry, it should use the keyboard to call up a different set of data and call up a different set of data and compare those to some reference values included in our charts. As I went on describing my recommendation, Ken Mattingly sat quietly, listening and reading our document. When I finally stopped talking, he looked up at me and asked, "Son, you're not a pilot, are you?" I was caught off guard by his question, so I shook my head. Let me explain something. At 6 Gs, I'll be pretty much flattened into my seat. I can read the displays, and if I need to, I can use the control stick because it's beside my leg. But I'll be damned if I'm going to reach up and punch in some numbers on the keyboard. I waited, not saying anything, not having much to say. He looked down at my charts again and said, "I suggest you come up with a different plan." The meeting was over, and I did. So that was earlier at the time that I was working on it. And then later on, starting with Apollo 15, I met another character who was actually a flight controller for Apollo. His name is Phil Schaefer. And he also taught me some lessons. Though I didn't play much of a role in Apollo 15, the little I did afforded me a learning experience that I would not soon forget. It came courtesy of another memorable NASA professional named Phil Schaefer. Phil had been a flight dynamics officer and a flight director on the Apollo missions through Apollo 11, meaning he was one of the folks who sat in a console in mission control room during a flight.
Even for the
By the time I encountered him, he was assistant chief. We done out there?
Yeah, we close the door.
Close the door.
Thank you. Okay. By the time I encountered him, he was assistant chief of the NASA Houston Flight Dynamics branch. During one particularly painful meeting with him, Phil schooled me on the use of good judgment. I was destined to have more meetings with Phil later on during my work on Space Shuttle. What I learned from him that day on Apollo 15 came to my rescue the next time. In the run-up to each Apollo mission, Phil conducted a weekly readiness review in an auditorium-sized room at the Manned Spacecraft Center. The NASA staff responsible for the various elements of an Apollo mission, plus their support contractors, were expected to update Phil on the progress of their work preparing for the upcoming mission. The meetings were uniformly dreaded. Phil was physically intimidated. He was not intimidated. He was intimidated. He stood well over 6 feet tall, carried about 300 pounds, very little of it baby fat. A colleague of mine once described sitting in a conference room when Phil arrived. Though his back was turned to him, he knew when Phil got there because the light from outside in the hall was blocked. Phil had a very low tolerance to bullshit. During his sessions, he'd sit at a table at the front of the room, facing his audience, displaying neither a smile nor any other pleasantness. He was an unrepentant chain smoker, so a veil of smoke continuously framed his face as if reinforcing some inner smolder waiting to erupt. It's hard to envision just how much people smoked in meetings in those days. When someone presented to him, Phil would listen without comment, except for an occasional question. If he was satisfied, he said, "Okay," consulted his agenda, and asked for the next presenter. If he wasn't satisfied, what Phil did next did bode well for the presenter, and I was on the receiving end of one of those responses. In an earlier session, Phil had asked my NASA task monitor, Dave Heath, to verify the value of a particular onboard computer parameter. It was called minimum up control altitude. It was one of the specific computer calculations the Apollo command module pilot monitored during reentry to be sure the guidance computer was functioning correctly. The details aren't important here, other than a value of 40 nautical miles was the number currently in use. Dave had handed the task off to me, always even pleased. I was set about it with typical obsessive, overly thorough approach. When it came time to report back to Phil, I was given the opportunity to do so. At the time, I took that as a vote of confidence to Dave, but I later wondered if he, who was a battered veteran of Phil's sessions, had little appetite for presenting himself. So I came to the meeting with about a half dozen very detailed charts that I prepared. When I was called on, I put the first one on the overhead projector and began taking Phil through the in-depth mathematical analysis of them. When I got to the second chart, Phil took the cigarette out of his mouth and rested the hand holding it on the table. He stared at me, frowning but not saying anything, while the cigarette burned itself down. I broke into a sweat. It didn't look like Phil was too happy. So I kept on talking, hoping I could postpone the time that he'd let me know. As I put up the third chart, Phil scanned it, glanced at the stack I had remaining, raised the cigarette hand, palm out, and said, "Stop." I fumbled a bit, but I did quit talking. Is there a point to this? Well, I was trying to show you how I calculated that minimum altitude. Put down the charts. Just tell me, is 40 good or not? Well, it's not that simple. It depends on the time of year, the latitude and re-entry point, the angle. Just tell me the goddamn minimum. I swallowed my breath. It took me a second or two to recover. I shuffled through my charts, put the last one on the projector, and pointed to it. Under worst case conditions, the minimum altitude should be 41 nautical miles, not 40. Phil stared at me as if he discovered a special breed of idiot. Christ, he said, not quite inaudibly. And then after a pause, we're not that good. I wasn't sure what to do. I looked over at Dave, who was seated nearby. You're recommending no change. He made it a direction, not a question. Dave nodded, said nothing. But he put a cigarette in his mouth, made a note, looked up at me again, and said, "Sit down." He glanced at me and said, "Who's next?" And I sat. In 1974, we were now starting on the Space Shuttle program. TRW lost what should have been a firm fixed price, no bid contract. They lost it and got no follow-on work for Space Shuttle. IBM had just won the contract to build all the onboard the software for Space Shuttle, and so they hired a bunch of engineers from TRW who literally moved down the street. I mean, it was walking distance to their location. And then I started working for IBM. And I got there a little late because I wasn't one of the original IBM engineers, so I didn't get the cool stuff like guidance and navigation and flight control that everybody wanted. They gave me displays and controls, which I was a little disappointed about. And I'm not going to review this today, but it turned out the astronauts were the ones that designed those, so I got to work with them. But it did provide me an opportunity to work with Phil again. Yeah, lucky me. 2 years later, after the Apollo program was officially over and I had moved on to work on Space Shuttle, I was to have another encounter with Phil, and that one would go a little bit better. By 1976, NASA had given Phil the title of Manager of Space Shuttle Program Flight Techniques and Software Integration. That meant he was in charge of having IBM and North American Rockwell resolve the misconnections between the requirements placed on the shuttle's flight software programs and the capacity of the software to execute them. Phil was more than up to the task. He served as both Flight Dynamics Officer and Flight Director during the Apollo and Skylab programs. Now he was flying out to down in California to run the Play Nice Together sessions with IBM and North American. And that meant I'd be doing a lot of meetings with him, and that's because I had displays and controls and touched a whole lot of stuff that was inside the orbiter. I wasn't looking forward to it. When I met him before during the Apollo program, the encounter with Phil subjected me to what I would now describe as his version of Shark Tank. That was 5 years earlier, and now I was with a new company, had more experience dealing with the NASA way, and still I'd be spending 2 weeks in front of Phil trying to defend the capabilities and limitations of IBM's recently restructured software, and in front of a deservedly hostile audience of Rockwell engineers who now need to significantly rework their expectations of it. Because of the sheer number and complexity of the shuttle hardware that systems that North American Rockwell had built, I was usually on the agenda at 4 or 5 meetings each day, and Phil chaired many of them. Fortunately for me, the painful lesson I learned from him to present my case simply and convincingly had stuck. I brought fewer charts to each session, and each one was as concise and clear as I could make it. Early in the first week, I was grilled with questions on Phil, and my responses were met with some skepticism by the Rockwell engineers. Still, Phil never put a cigarette down to stare at me. so I knew at least I wasn't losing ground there. By the end of that week, I gained enough credibility with him that while he wasn't exactly defending my position, he'd begun asking more of the hard questions of hardware engineers, especially about what changes they'd have to make on their end to get it to work with our software. And I started reading again. One of the highlights for me came near the end of the second week, though it didn't start well. An earlier meeting had run over schedule, making me late for my next one with Phil. I got to his conference room about 15 minutes late, and several agenda items into the discussion. So I came through a door in the back of the room, hoping he would notice. And he did. "You're late, Clemons," he said, startling the person who had been presenting to me. I was about to sit down, but I thought better of it. "Sorry, Phil, my last meeting ran long." I described what we had been agreeing on in that one. He stared at me for a second, the cigarette hand resting on the table. And I said, "Oh, crap." Then he told the mostly Rockwell audience, "We're starting over. There's no point in going through the agenda without getting IBM's input on the effects of the software." He waved the engineer who had been petitioning him for no hardware changes to sit down, and then he looked at his agenda and called up the first speaker again. Phil wanted the hardware engineers to explain their stance to me. Wow. A good thing I take his moniker that is true to me to heart. The rest of that meeting and the week went well. I went home with a large number of actions required by IBM, but so did North American Rockwell. And I think a good balance was struck in getting the two parties to work together, and after yet another rather laborious and tedious reprogramming by the IBM team, the software did fit in the computer's memory and ran with the speed of execution needed to complete the shuttle mission. As it happened, after those 2 weeks in California, I was seated next to Phil on the flight home. I got around to asking him if he remembered my presentation to him back in the Apollo days. He laughed. "Well, I don't remember it was you, but I remember that session, and I was wondering why this guy was giving me a goddamn doctoral dissertation when all I needed was yes or no." Okay, so I have one more excerpt I'll read to you. So one of the things that happened working on walk and shoot down that's me, is when you're working, back in those days, when you were working, and actually this is still true, when you were working on the space program in Houston, the Space Center was built out in the middle of nowhere, absolutely nowhere. It was a cattle ranch, actually, a cattle pasture. And everything was built up around it, so that everybody in the area worked together. You know, either you worked on the program, or you were an astronaut, or you were, selling groceries. Everybody was together and knew each other. And by the time I got to work for Shuttle, I was now no longer the junior guy, and so I started with IBM. I started dealing with my neighbors who were astronauts. And one of them, Michael Lane, his name is, was an astronaut that was scheduled to did fly 3 space shuttle missions, but at the time I met him, he had just been assigned a mission to fly. And as it happened, one of the astronauts to fly with him was Judy Resnick, who later was killed in the Challenger accident. But so Mike and I would go jogging, and he would tell me how hot she was, all the time. But this story that I'm going to read to you now, or this excerpt, is after I left the program, but I got Mike to come up to make a presentation to some people at IBM. I was now working for IBM marketing up in New York. Although I had moved on from Houston before Space Shuttle Discovery touchdown, I had one more encounter with my old friend and neighbor, Mike Millay. In mid-1985, the IBM group I joined in White Plains, New York, hosted a technology conference and invited executives from other corporations to attend. Since this wasn't so long after Mike's flight on Discovery, I called him in Houston and persuaded him to be our featured speaker. He hadn't forgotten about my personal memento. When he came into town, he brought along the photo he'd taken of Judy Redlick during their time in orbit, and that she had signed for me with her regards. At the conference the next day, we introduced Mike with some NASA footage taken during his flight, set to a recording of Elton John's Rockman. Mike presented highlights and narrated photographs from his days aboard Discovery. But then he turned the story about how very happy he was that the IBM Space Shuttle computer software had worked so well on his flight. A special system of plumbing and valves had been developed for the Space Shuttle to use in orbit that was designed to dispose of wastewater into the vacuum of space. Because of an unexpected blockage in one of the valves on Discovery, the effluent flowed too slowly and accumulated into a massive frozen blob of waste that adhered to the external surface of the orbiter. It was a serious and even life-threatening problem. The icicle was about a foot wide and 2.5 feet long and weighed somewhere in the vicinity of 30 pounds. And it was stuck to the hull of the orbiter. If it wasn't removed, it could snap off during re-entry, collide with the orbiter, and damage the heat shield towers. Mike told our industry executives audience that he had imagined a lot of ways he might die in space. But not one of them was getting killed by a frozen chunk of urine. The block of ice was finally removed by Mission Commander Mike Hartsfield, who carefully maneuvered the shuttle's remote manipulator arm and bumped it against the icicle until it broke free. The RMS itself was built in Canada, but was controlled by an onboard computer running IBM's shuttle flight software. Mike reported that he was living proof that Discovery's subsequent atmospheric re-entry was successful. But he said that large block of frozen waste was likely still out there, somewhere, orbiting the Earth. And he cautioned any alien race traveling from some faraway star to visit and explore the Earth to observe the old Boy Scout rule: don't eat yellow snow. So those are excerpts from the book, and that's also pretty much catches the tone of what I'm trying to do with it. So if we have any questions, anything you'd like to know, you want me to read the whole book?
Is someone selling it in the theaters?
Not yet, no, it's available. You can order it, advanced copy from Amazon right now. And probably just not being released. Or you can same thing with most of the ones that you get it from publisher with University of Florida. But it'll be everywhere. What I've discovered from all this, the official release date for it is September 16th, I think, and I was asking them, since you have it by mid-August, why? And because their distribution network is such that by that time, the bookstores that have ordered it will also have it. So they do the official release date when you can walk into any of the bookstores and get it. Yes?
Is it available in ebook or only?
Not yet, hardback. Although there will be, this is a side for, this is surreal to me because I just wrote science fiction stuff which you get paid nothing for. But they apparently have gotten an agreement to do an audiobook version of it about 16 months later, and I'm going, well, this is a memoir. Yeah, no, you're not going to read it. Okay.
What actor did they choose?
I don't know. So my agent asked me, who do you want to play me? And I said, Casey Affleck. Tortured young engineer.
What's your title, Earl Jones?
David Earl Jones, yeah. Yes.
So when I started studying computer science in college back in the mid-'80s, there was a big emphasis on ADA, on the theory that it was a Department of Defense language was supposed to make it impossible for certain sorts of mistakes to be introduced.
Right.
ADA has not exactly set the world on fire at large. So based on your experiences with IBM, with working on all these very mission-critical software systems, what is your view of trying to structure languages to foster reliable code versus doing it in other ways?
It's doing it in other ways. There's a whole section in here that I talk about John Aaron, which I don't know if you know John Aaron. If you don't, look up John Aaron. Go to YouTube and get SCE to talks. Look that up and you'll see John Aaron and how he saved Apollo 12. Well, yeah. It's a free market district. But John was my contract agent for the Space Shuttle software, and he put a requirement in there that said you have to provide error-free code. I went over to see him. I don't want to give this too much of this away because this is in here, but I went over to see him because I had now, by that time, I had taken over the management of that project. And I go, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know him from Apollo days. And he goes, I said, error-free, I mean, you can't do that. He goes, okay, so how many critical errors is IBM willing to sign up for? I said, well, you said, zero is the wrong answer, right? So I mean, it's a system that if it fails, causes loss of life. This runs everything on the show. What's the right number? What does IBM want to sign up for? It's like, crap. I mean, he said, look, I get it. I do. But I will tell you also this. If I tell IBM, in your contract, it's zero, and I take away profitability every time you don't hit that, I know I'll get the best software I can get, which is what he did. And he was willing to pay for additional programming or tools or whatever it took. But I also had to go over there once a month with every error that slipped through the cracks. After we released it, and Rockwell and others got it, I had to go over there with all the big ones. He didn't really catch me with little ones, but the big ones and say, how does that happen? How did they get through your development process? How did you get through your test process? Tell me, by the way, since it's a software thing, can we work around it, or do we have to trust you guys to program it right this time? Or are there other errors of signature hiding in there that you don't know about? It was torturous, but that team ended up providing still the highest quality software ever developed for the U.S. government, any project. Still is. It's amazing. And that's
And what language was it written in?
it was HALS. Does that help you? That's why I said about ADA. HALS was developed by Draco Labs, I believe it was. And it was a specific language specifically delivered for the shuttle to do real-time operations at a little bit higher level. And everybody said really meant HALS is like one off of IBM, right? So it was like, HAL from 2001.
Okay, so how does the hardware on the shuttle compare to modern hardware that they're using?
Well, that's a good question. So the hardware, I'm going to be, if somebody needs to come in, we're going to let them come. And I'll take it outside. Let's start with Apollo. Apollo to Shuttle was a transformation. I mean, at Apollo we were using, and this is 1969 to 1972, we were using slide rules. Right, and on Shuttle they had onboard computers. The technology was changing fast, and then they upgraded the technology 2 or 3 times on Shuttle. So it kept moving on and on and on. And now the software didn't. That was the thing that, I mean, if you know these programs, you don't, in any big contract like that, you don't screw around with software. You just can't. You start over if you do that. You get it working, you leave it alone, so that you start working. Same thing with key hardware. You start working around that, which means the technology is always going to be outdated from our system. Always, because you froze it at a point, you can't stabilize. That's the Sir.
What kind of project are you working on?
I'm sorry?
What kind of project do you have? Thinking about preparing the stuff
I don't know. It's all kind of weird. Phil is larger than life. I think he died actually in racing. It was just enormously influential individual. Okay, we gotta go. I'll go outside.